1939 is thought of as the peak of the Hollywood studio system for very good reason. When you think of the industry today, the studio is a dirty word. They exclusively make movies worse, right? Less artistic, more generic, dependent upon extended franchise universes, and plots simple enough to be exported around the world. We instinctively have more respect for auteurs and singular visions that weren't touched by the guys in the boardroom who signed the checks. But 1939 shows us that an assembly line approach to movie making can work and can be breathtakingly artistic when it's done right. We are in this sweet spot as we're slowly coming out of the Great Depression, cinema technology is advancing rapidly, we're not in World War II yet, and television isn't here yet, so studios are firing on all cylinders, and Hollywood is truly a dream machine for the American public, dealing in archetype and star power and visual spectacle. I think the most striking aspect of 1939's award season is the variety we have. Within the Best Picture nominees alone, there are historical epics, of course, but also a fantasy movie, a western, a political drama, various women-led stories, period pieces, romantic comedies, tragedies. And the crown jewel of 1939 is Gone with the Wind, the nearly 4-hour-long masterpiece about the Civil War and Reconstruction era, literally the destruction and rebirth of a civilization, told through the eyes of a sociopathic and legendary Southern belle, Scarlett O'Hara. At the 1939 Oscars, Gone with the Wind wins 8 competitive awards and 2 special awards. So talking about this year seems counterintuitive because it was a total blowout, which might not look like the most compelling story for a deep dive. There isn't really any clandestine reason as to why Gone with the Wind won. It was the longest and most ambitious movie ever made in America, and was about to become the most popular, most widely seen singular media experience in, the entirety of world history up to that point. Of course, it's going to win everything. But I wanted an opportunity to maybe provide a different perspective on the movie. It's been simultaneously beloved and hated since the 30s, but it's one of my favorites ever, and I really do believe that feeling awed by its impossible scope and sprawling themes and mythic tragedy is essential to understanding why movies are so powerful. So I've watched all of the movies nominated above the line, and I'm going to go through each category at the 12th Academy Awards and unpack what made Gone with the Wind an Oscars favorite, what makes it such a contentious movie, and also the categories people chose to ignore the movie in, because there's an embarrassment of riches this year when it comes to great movies and performances and narratives going on, all of which give insight into where the movie industry had come from and where it was going. Alright, so let's talk about Gone with the Wind. This is a topic so sprawling that it's actually intimidating. I could talk for hours and still barely scratch the surface. And beyond that, there are also 10 total Best Picture nominees this year, so we have a lot to cover. And side note, as I go through all of these movies throughout this video, let me know which you've seen or which you plan to watch or what your favorite of this year is, because I'm curious to see which of these have actually stood the test of time and are still watched by people. So, the big name I'm going to be repeating over and over again throughout this video is David O. Selznick. Make no mistake, it doesn't matter who was in the director's chair, who got writing credits, this was Selznick's movie. Selznick was insane, and I'm really in awe of his drive to cobble together such an impossible project. Mind you, he's hopped up on speed through this entire production, so he was staying up all night, rewriting the script with various collaborators, micromanaging everything, swapping out directors. It's absolutely nuts.
Once in a while, I'd say, give me one of those things to stay awake. And, once in a while I would have one, and I would go in there and type all night long.
Selznick had jumped from studio to studio since the very beginning of the sound era. He was one of the heads of RKO, a studio he revitalized in less than 2 years. He figured out how to cut down budgets and also give more trust to producers to enact their own vision. And that resulted in King Kong, one of the biggest hits of the pre-Code era. Selznick was a notorious perfectionist. I mean, he was clearly brilliant and type A and viewed the producer as the true engine of a movie. Because of this, he decided to start his own independent production company, Selznick International Pictures, in 1935. Just a year later, his assistant and story editor Kay Brown suggested he purchase Gone with the Wind, Margaret Mitchell's 1,000-page novel that had just become a crazy best-selling phenomenon. I don't have time to fully detail the absurd production process, how the press was calling the movie Selznick's folly during filming, the 2-year-long search for Scarlett O'Hara, which drummed up publicity and resulted in one of the best casting decisions of all time, the release schedule where it was shown at limited roadshow screenings for over a year before entering general release, and how it reportedly sold around 60 million tickets in its US initial run, which is equal to literally half the population at that time. All of that is fascinating and contributes to Gone with the Wind being such a singular achievement, but I'm here to talk Oscars. Throughout the year, people really weren't sure if Gone with the Wind was going to meet its December premiere or get pushed out to 1940. So, in early predictions, it was sort of tabled, treated like a wild card that might not even be a factor. But when it snuck into Oscar eligibility under the wire with its December 15th, 1939 premiere, everything changed. Almost every review ranged from, "This was great and lived up to expectations," to, "This is the most magnificent motion picture of all time." Some people even started suggesting that Gone with the Wind be excluded from normal Oscar contention and given its own separate set of awards from the Academy, thereby leaving the regular awards for the more regular picture output. So this was something special, and everyone knew a sweep was coming. But in the lead up to its release, the movie did have its share of controversies. Gone with the Wind perennially gets dredged up in cultural conversation as the big bad movie, with most controversy stemming from its historically inaccurate and sanitized portrayal of the antebellum South and slavery. I don't know if most people realize that the movie was contentious in its day, too. Like, these aren't issues that everyone was oblivious to in the 30s. It actually got attacked from pretty much all angles back then, even from the sides you wouldn't expect. Some Southerners, such as the organization the Daughters of the Confederacy, threatened to protest over the casting of a British woman, Vivien Leigh, as a Southern girl. There was particular concern about whether Leigh could get the dialect right. For example, would she use the term you all as a singular pronoun, something that Northerners apparently thought the South did, but the South denies? This is how granular we were getting. Some Northern veterans groups boycotted the movie because they thought it would characterize Union soldiers as hideous marauders who attacked women. And most notably, there was the backlash from Black activists. Before the movie even started filming, many groups and activists expressed their concern over the fact that the movie was getting made in the first place, because the story misrepresents slavery, promulgates the Southern lost cause narrative, and would encourage bigotry. They pointed out the indignity in Black actors having to audition as slaves and read out demeaning lines. Earl J. Morris, the movie editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, one of the biggest Black newspapers at the time, charged that 75 years of racial self-respect has flown with the breeze in the much ballyhooed Hollywood epic film Gone with the Wind. Walter White of the NAACP particularly spearheaded this activist push against the movie. He quickly began writing to Selznick, asking that he hire a Black consultant to provide insight and push for accuracy during the making of the movie. Selznick did work with Walter throughout the production process, but the two technical advisors he wound up hiring were white, so D for effort on that one. White and Morris both also lobbied heavily to ensure that the N-word wouldn't be used in the screenplay, because it is used in the book. and Selznick acquiesced to this. As a business and PR-minded person, Selznick was well aware he was wading into precarious waters with this movie's subject matter. He obviously knew all about The Birth of a Nation and did not plan to end up as D.W. Griffith 2.0. In memos to the screenwriter Sidney Howard, he expressed that he had no intention of making an offensive movie. Tweaks were made to the screenplay to temper the racial politics, and he asked that Howard remove all mentions of the KKK, saying, "I do hope that you will agree with me on this omission of what might come out as an unintentional advertisement for intolerant societies in these fascist-ridden times." Upon the movie's release, reactions in the black press were primarily negative. Most definitely still found the movie morally reprehensible, and there were even some protests outside of theaters where it was showing. One review in the Pittsburgh Courier wrote that instead of glorifying the racial progress of the past decades, Hollywood has chosen rather to glorify the fruits and follies of oppression. Fact, again, has bowed out to fiction and fancy. Truth, again, has gone with the wind. One review from the Chicago Defender, another black-run newspaper, argued that Gone with the Wind was more dangerous than The Birth of a Nation, calling it a weapon of terror against Black America. There were also some positive reactions, mostly stemming from the idea that the movie was an opportunity for Black actors, regardless of the context of their roles. An earlier review in that same newspaper highlighted the movie for exhibiting Black artistry. Black columnists Ralph Matthews and Lillian Johnson both defended the movie in the newspaper The Afro-American and argued that protests were ill-informed and that any author had the right to present whatever view of reality they wanted. Again, much of this positive attention coalesced around Hattie McDaniel, because this was one of the most prominent acting showcases a Black actor had ever gotten in Hollywood up to this point, and we'll definitely get to Hattie more later. But regardless, despite the backlash, the movie obviously became the biggest hit on Earth. Selznick had done it. I referenced Selznick's screenwriting memos earlier, and there was a whole book published of all his correspondences throughout production. If you take the time to read it, it's legitimately insane how directly involved he was with every minute decision on such a sprawling project. From the intricacies of the screenplay, to the billing on the poster, to the exhibition plan, he looped in record companies to get them to produce records of the movie's score, because he anticipated that people would clamor for any merchandise related to the movie. He brainstormed with his assistant about whether it would be best for Clark Gable and Vivian Leigh to arrive in Atlanta for the movie's premiere in secret, so that the press would be surprised when Scarlett and Rhett made their dramatic entrance at the event they were holding. He was compulsively involved in everything and had a clear vision about what this movie should look like and how it should be packaged. And there had never been anything like this before, so he was really blazing a new trail. So needless to say, Hollywood was more than ready to award him on Oscar night. It wasn't even a question. And I want to take a beat to talk more about the artistic merit of Gone with the Wind. Like I said, I view it as one of the best and most important works to come out of the entire medium, and that was even more true for people back in 1939 who had never seen anything this gigantic before. Some reviews hailed it as literally entering in a new film era. It wasn't the first big ambitious movie ever made, but it was the longest and the first in beautiful Hollywood Technicolor. I think the epic as an art form is sort of lost on people today, where culture has become much more niche and fragmented and postmodern. But at its core, to make an epic, all-encompassing tome like Gone with the Wind is to create a full world out of a singular, imperfect experience that encapsulates broad cosmic strokes of emotion and universal truth. That's essentially the purpose of art. The beauty and strength of Gone with the Wind is definitely not that it tells a bird's-eye view textbook recounting of the Civil War and Reconstruction era, or that it's accurate about the inhuman realities of slavery in the antebellum South. The movie is none of those things, as its source material was written by a Southern woman basically constructing a story around the testimonies of her own Confederate veteran relatives. What the movie does do is take a very specific moment in time through the eyes of the very selfish and fascinating character of Scarlett and extrapolate this one historical moment out to mirror the cyclical collapse of civilizations throughout all of history, not just 1800s America, and explore human perseverance and self-actualization and our inability to move on from the past, and the brutality of war and the cruelty we're capable of. It's about what happens when a world crumbles and what type of people are able to adapt and survive. It's a melodrama and a biting look at gender relations and a harrowing war epic and, even towards the end, a sort of cruel gothic drama. Not to mention, it gives us what I would call one of the most fully fleshed out cinematic portraits of a woman and of women's interpersonal relationships ever made. The movie is just such a rich, complex tapestry that to view it through one single dimension, rather than opening yourself up to the enormity of the work, I view that as doing a disservice to yourself, and I think everyone should at least watch the movie themselves and engage with it fully. Okay, that's my spiel, and now we have to keep moving because we still have 9 Best Picture nominees to talk about. I never promised a short video. Based on nominations and acclaim and commercial success, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is most likely our distant second place movie. In a list of nominees where at least half of them are timeless classics, this movie still manages to stand out as something truly shocking and impactful. At the time, director Frank Capra is one of the great darlings of the industry and the American public, as a director who was still in touch with the everyman. The movie premiered in Washington, D.C. at an event with a bunch of congressmen and members of the press present. And since the movie depicts a good-hearted working-class hero becoming a senator and learning that greed and dishonesty are at the heart of American politics, the response from this audience was, unsurprisingly, mixed to say the least. Many senators thought it was a covert attempt to undermine democracy and would make America look like a joke to the rest of the world. Capra even alleged later that some senators had tried to buy the rights for the movie to pull it from release. And apparently, in a very petty turn of events, this movie reinvigorated Congress's interest in the Neely anti-block booking bill as a means to keep movie studios from getting too powerful. And as we know, this bill would eventually lead to the collapse of the entire studio system in the next couple decades. But critics loved the movie and praised it as an example of Hollywood still managing to take on controversial topics in spite of measures like the Hays Code. The movie made Jimmy Stewart a star and became regarded as one of Capra's best. And though the movie definitely reflects the trademark Capra wide-eyed optimism, I think what makes this potentially his best work is the way we watch that optimism get completely distorted. While the ending of the movie, spoiler alert, is a triumphant moment, there's also this sense that Pandora's box can't be resealed. We can't unsee the fact that we're surrounded by corruption on all sides, which is a very dark and uncomfortable idea that definitely still resonates today. Our next nominee, Goodbye Mr. Chips, was originally a book released in the middle of the decade, focusing on a Latin teacher and later headmaster of a boarding school from his first day on the job all the way to the end of his life. Through the story, we get important British historical events woven into the narrative, most notably the onset of the First World War. The book was a massive hit both in the US and the UK, and this movie, starring our Best Actor winner Robert Donat and Best Actress nominee Greer Garson, was just as well received. It's a very maudlin movie. It feels very much like the character-driven dramas of the time, but people really fell in love with it. Tender, endearing, moving, charming. That was the vibe of most reviews. And we'll go more in depth about the 2 lead performances when we get to those categories, but when you look at how beloved those performances were, how beloved the movie was, and the fact that Sam Wood gets a Best Director nomination even though this isn't a particularly directory movie, you get the sense that this must have been a major contender. especially because the Academy has already shown their proclivity for decades-spanning family stories with previous Best Picture winners like Cimarron or Cavalcade. I'd probably guess that this was the de facto third-place choice after Mr. Smith, which is surprising in a category with so many other movies that people today hold in much higher regard than this one. Speaking of movies that people today hold in much higher regard than Goodbye Mr. Chips, The Wizard of Oz was nominated for Best Picture this year as well. This movie is iconic and one of the main reasons that 1939 has the reputation that it has, but it's important to distinguish the general perception of the movie today compared with the opinion at the time. The Wizard of Oz definitely got great reviews, but the tone critics took didn't make it feel like something that was dramatic or adult enough to win Best Picture. It was more viewed as a great achievement in fantasy, almost along the lines of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, which had come out a few years prior. One review from Screenplay said that it would blow you back into childhood, and the New York Times said, "It is all so well-intentioned, so genial, and so gay that any reviewer who would look down his nose at the fun-making should be spanked and sent off supperless to bed." The movie also did pretty well financially, but it didn't gain its prestigious, capital I important status really until the 50s, when it became the first full feature-length movie to be shown on TV annually. Like any big TV event back then, literally like half the country would tune in to watch it, so it was cemented as a national classic. For now, though, it gets 6 nominations, mostly tech and music related. Stagecoach from John Ford is one of the most well-regarded westerns of all time, and it essentially re-energized the genre. Westerns played a major role in the development of cinema throughout the first couple decades of the 20th century. They were extremely popular as silent movies, partially because they mythologized an era that Americans had just lived through. In fact, the era of the Wild West is so close to the beginnings of Hollywood that these totemic figures of the West we think of today, like Buffalo Bill or Annie Oakley, actually appeared in some of the earliest silent movies. But once talking pictures hit in the late 20s, the genre took a back seat. A ton of westerns were still made, but most were essentially B-movies, cheap, serialized, and formulaic. John Ford returned to the genre and combined the fast-moving excitement of these 30s B-movies with real gravitas and thematic heft, leading reviewers to call it a western to end westerns. Another reviewer said, "Stagecoach is a western, but when you say that, don't smile. It's no laughing matter except when it is meant to be. It has comedy, but it has also drama, suspense, cumulative excitement, and gallantry. I think the gallantry may be most important." Basically, John Ford classed up the joint. His ensemble of characters bumping along in a stagecoach together transcend genre trope and instead come to represent broader American myth. He also introduced the mainstream to John Wayne and added in standout technical elements like the score and cinematography, which were praised by critics and led to its eventual 7 Oscar nominations. Our next nominee is Ninotchka, a romantic comedy directed by Ernst Lubitsch, who had already had a couple of his movies nominated for Best Picture and Best Director in the past. The tone Lubitsch strikes in his movies is famously enchanting and clever and totally all-encompassing, which I think only gets enhanced when Billy Wilder's writing your script. Ninotchka is unique because Greta Garbo plays a Soviet ambassador, while Melvyn Douglas is a Parisian aristocrat, and their will they or won't they relationship becomes a proxy for the ideological tension between communism and capitalism. Soviet austerity is miserable, so move out of your gross apartment with a dozen roommates in Moscow and come be a capitalist in Paris and buy fun hats. This is just a really clever screenwriting concept that brought a more cerebral edge to the genre, and it was novel at the time for a movie to be anti-Soviet in this way, even if it was all wrapped up in this lighthearted comedic package. The New York Times review for the movie opens with a 4-word sentence, "Stalin won't like it." But critics loved it, and it was in the mix for Best Director at the New York Film Critics Awards. The movie also earned a ton of acclaim for Greta Garbo, which helped her beat the box office poison allegations and earned her a short-lived career revival, but we'll get to her later. Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men was a huge phenomenon of the late 30s. The book about ranch workers in the Great Depression saw great commercial success and acclaim in 1937, and was immediately turned into an acclaimed Broadway play. And then, as was standard practice, it was optioned and turned into a Best Picture-nominated movie. For the time, the story was controversial because of the working-class profanity used throughout and the running theme of euthanasia, which the Hays Code cleaned up a bit by making it more clear that George gets arrested at the end of the movie after he does what he does. The movie was well received by critics who applauded it for retaining the gritty realism of the book. They praised Burgess Meredith and Lon Chaney Jr., and many especially singled out Betty Field as the lonely ranch manager's wife. But many critics also pointed out that the movie is a pretty big downer, and questioned whether Steinbeck's depressing material was commercially viable. A review in Motion Picture Herald wrote, "Yes, there are those clinically inclined persons who want the smell of a sociological ether in their pictures, plays, and books. But the millions get all the depression they want without buying tickets for more." And I think this turned out to be true. Lots of reports I found from theater owners across the country showed that audiences weren't feeling it. It is the slowest movie picture I believe I ever played, and ends with you wondering what it's all about. Moral is not got over to audience. The brutal scene of killing the old dog sickens some of our patrons. A good picture, but don't expect a small-town public to get excited about it. I mean, the movie is definitely not an uplifting time, but I think it's a pretty faithful adaptation and has the same vague uneasiness and tension of the book, where you're sort of waiting for something bad to happen, and then it does. But it ended up being one of the lower-grossing Best Picture nominees, and while there was some precedent for depressing movies winning Best Picture, I think that's probably why it didn't gain more traction. Next, Wuthering Heights was a movie with a ton of built-in prestige. It is, of course, based on the canonical Bronte novel, produced by Samuel Goldwyn's independent company, directed by William Wyler, one of the most dependable directors of the studio system, and brought legendary British screen actor Laurence Olivier as the brooding, mysterious Heathcliff to Hollywood stardom. It's romantic and gothic and aesthetically striking, too. Frank Nugent's New York Times review called it unquestionably one of the most distinguished pictures of the year, one of the finest ever produced by Mr. Goldwyn, and one you should decide to see. The New York Film Critics Circle gave it Best Picture after a lengthy fight between pro and anti-Gone with the Wind voters. Apparently, supporters of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington eventually piled all their votes onto Wuthering Heights to block Gone with the Wind from winning. And Wuthering Heights ended up with 8 nominations: Best Picture, Director, 2 acting nominations, Screenplay, and a few techs, so an impressive, well-rounded haul. But ultimately it seems to be one of those movies that people respected rather than loved, and those aren't typically the movies that win Best Picture. I noticed in particular a lot of the big Hollywood fan magazines, where articles might better reflect what the average moviegoer might think, spoke to this. One review in Photoplay said, "Wuthering Heights was an artistic production, magnificently acted, but for me, and seemingly once again I'm just an average movie fan, it was too dreary to be purely enjoyable. Maybe it was art, but it wasn't entertainment." Another review in Screenland said, "Stark and somber, brooding and forbidding, beautifully and artistically produced and directed and acted as it still does not spell entertainment in my dictionary." Next up, and I promise we're almost done, Dark Victory was Warner Brothers' biggest dramatic awards play of the year. It's about a young heiress, Betty Davis, who enjoys her hedonistic life, but is suddenly diagnosed with a brain tumor and given a year to live. We'll talk about it more in the Best Actress section, but Davis wasn't called the 5th Warner Brother for nothing. Around this time, she's the studio's biggest draw, and also maybe the most respected actor in the business, so prestige dramas like this one were pretty much built around her. Dark Victory was originally a Broadway show, and when Davis found out about it, she spent over a year pestering every producer on the Warner Brothers lot to make this movie, because she knew what a legendary performance this could be. Her instincts were right, of course, and this remains one of her greatest roles. It was a big financial hit, and critics went nuts for Betty, which we'll get to. The movie itself isn't too notable on a technical level, so ultimately it just gets 3 nominations, Picture, Actress, Score, and settles in as probably a mid to low tier Best Picture contender. For our last nominee, Love Affair was one of the surprise hits of the year, starring Charles Boyer and Irene Dunne as 2 separately engaged people who meet on a ship and then fall in love, and I guess I won't spoil anything further than that. It's directed by Leo McCarey, who was hot off of a Best Director win for The Awful Truth 2 years prior. McCarey is one of those directors who doesn't necessarily get brought up that much these days in conversations about the great old Hollywood directors, but at the time he was incredibly well respected, and lauded as pretty much the high watermark of a director working within the studio system. One review said, McCarey has proved time and time again worthy of the highest faith a filmgoer can place in a screen artist. He has never, so far as we can recall, betrayed either his players or his audiences. So it's a little surprising that he didn't get a director nomination for this, but I guess that's a testament to how competitive this year was. Boyer and especially Dunne are great as well. Especially in the first act, there's a great grounded feeling to their relationship. There's a very big tone shift halfway through the movie that obviously works for most people, but it doesn't really work for me, so it feels like the weakest in this lineup, even though it's still a classic in its own right and really shines, especially again in that first act. Off of this movie, Boyer and Dunne became known as one of the great romantic Hollywood screen pairings, and because of that, they starred together in another movie, When Tomorrow Comes, just a few months later. Victor Fleming is a weird case because in this year alone he directed Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz, which you could argue are literally the 2 most iconic movies ever made, but I don't think anyone out there considers Fleming among the best directors of all time. The director's chair of Gone with the Wind was notoriously like a revolving door. It was touched by a million different people, but George Cukor was the initial choice. Ultimately, Cukor was fired early into production, partially because Selznick found him harder to push around, but also reportedly because of Clark Gable's concerns that Cukor had the sentiments of a women's director. So Fleming replaced Cukor, but was ill throughout production, often having to take long breaks where other directors would step in. In his book about the making of Gone with the Wind, author Gavin Lambert estimated that ultimately Fleming really only directed around 45% of the movie. Sam Wood did 15%, production designer Bill Menzies did 15%, George Cukor wound up with about 5%, and second unit directors did another 20%. Ultimately, a production this scattered is a great example of the studio system at its peak, able to deliver incredible products all while switching out the directors 1, 2, 3, 4 times during filming and then editing all the piecemeal scenes together. This is exactly why Selznick got so much credit for being Gone with the Wind's primary overseer. The Wizard of Oz had a similarly scattered production with multiple directors, so ultimately Fleming is remembered more or less as a solid journeyman director for MGM, as opposed to a distinct authorial voice. But his win for Gone with the Wind was inevitable. And the push and pull between directorial voice and producer's influence was definitely relevant at the time. In early 1940, Selznick actually sent a very lengthy memo about this to Frank Capra, who was the president of the Directors Guild at the time. Apparently, directors within the guild were irritated about Selznick getting all the credit for the movie, and implied that Selznick was trying to overstate his own involvement in order to take credit away from the director, Fleming. So Selznick basically starts throwing his weight around and tells them they certainly don't want to go down this road with him. It's really fierce, honestly. Frankly, if it is Victor Fleming they are trying to serve, I can only say that the more they talk about it, the more they are going to reveal just how much this was a producer-made picture. We went ahead with the script, with the casting, with the sets, with the color plans, with the staff, and with all the fabulous preparation involved in a picture of this size, long before Victor Fleming ever came near it. When Victor did come on the picture, and often subsequently, he said, "This is your picture, David. I am doing exactly what you tell me to do, and I hope it turns out all right." I do not mean this in any way to detract from the brilliant job that Victor did. I have gone on record with the press many times, starting with almost the first rushes that he directed, that in my opinion he was doing one of the greatest directorial jobs the industry has ever seen. I think that if Victor does not win the Academy Award for his job on this picture, it will be in large measure traceable to the detraction from his work that has been occasioned by his well-meaning friends, particularly if they persist in forcing the exact facts about the picture to become more widely known. He then goes on to explain that Fleming did a bunch of work while he was not in good health and hadn't even really been able to finish reading the novel, but rose to the challenge regardless. So basically, Selznick's saying, if you really want to press the issue and expose who did what on the movie, this will not go well for you, because I did it all and Victor Fleming barely directed it. But I'm being charitable and giving him the credit because I like the guy, so let's all just shut up about it and everybody wins. But back to this race. Regarding the other nominees in this category, none of the others had a chance. Frank Capra was probably the second choice, though he had already won 3 Best Director Oscars at this point and won Best Picture twice, and we're only on ceremony number 12 here, so don't feel too bad for him. He's also pretty much single-handedly keeping Columbia Pictures afloat throughout the 30s, so much so that studio head Harry Cohn allowed Capra's name to go above the movie title on posters, a show of the director's ownership over the project, which was basically unheard of at the time. John Ford was another Academy favorite nominated for Stagecoach, who had won Best Director a few years prior and was about to win it 2 more times in a row, so he was on the table as well. Sam Wood gets nominated for Goodbye Mr. Chips, and like I said before, I think this highlights how beloved this movie was, and in a weaker year it probably would have been a bigger contender. Finally, William Wyler gets mentioned for Wuthering Heights. He's still at the beginning of his career, and this is laying the groundwork for him to become the most nominated director in history, but Wuthering Heights didn't really have enough passion behind it to be anywhere close to the winner. For snubs, you could point to any of the other Best Picture nominees that didn't make it in. I'd imagine Fleming was probably pretty close to earning a historic double nomination with The Wizard of Oz. Edmund Goulding was also probably relatively close for Dark Victory, and fun fact, he's also tied for having the most Best Picture nominations, 3, without any Best Director nominations to show for it. Such is the life of a studio system director. For the Writing Awards, things are broken up into 2 categories this year: Best Story and Best Screenplay, as a relic of the studio system. Best Story essentially refers to the concept of a movie, a document that would lay out the movie's plot and its characters. On the other hand, Best Screenplay refers to the actual script of the movie with all of the dialogue written out. These things could be written by the same person, or a writer could sell a story to a studio where another screenwriter would then step in and actually come up with the dialogue. I'm not going to go too far into the minutiae of this because who knows how people actually judged these categories in practice, but at least knowing the difference gives you some context. The only movies nominated in both categories are Ninotchka and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. Ninotchka is a very writery movie, so no surprise there, and same goes for Mr. Smith. It's very well structured and has incredible monologues on monologues. And it ultimately wins Best Story. It's the movie's only win of the night, and I think this category is a great way to recognize it as a whole. I want to give a quick highlight to a nominee that we haven't talked about yet that shows up here. I'm literally Ginger Rogers stan #1. I'm obsessed with her, and Bachelor Mother is a great star vehicle for her. It's a rom-com where she plays a shop girl who, through some hijinks, gets mistaken as the mother of a baby abandoned at an orphanage. Ginger Rogers is an incredible comedian, especially when she's playing this sort of exasperated, smartest person in the room type role. And this movie came out as she was transitioning away from the Astaire Rogers musicals that had made her one of the biggest stars in the business. So it was definitely reassurance that she could carry her own movie without having to dance around backwards and in heels, so to speak. Next, Best Screenplay consisted entirely of Best Picture nominees. And there was really no question, Gone with the Wind won, and it's one of the more well-deserved awards of the night. The fact that, despite the chaos of the movie's production, the end product condenses a 1,000-page book so flawlessly, weaving together pretty much every nuanced character arc from the text, all in around 200 minutes, is incredibly impressive. The writing credit went to Sidney Howard alone, who becomes the first posthumous Oscar winner ever, as he had passed away in a tractor accident during post-production. But the full story is more complicated. Selznick wrote in a memo that he essentially gave Howard the sole writing credit as a sign of respect. He says, "Some time ago, it was my intention to have, in addition to the Sidney Howard credit on Gone with the Wind, a list of contributing writers. I would rather now abandon this idea. First, because while it is true that Sidney Howard did only a portion of the script, there is no other writer who worked on it whose contribution is worth serious mention. Second, because our titles are cluttered enough as it is. And third, because I don't want to deprive Sidney Howard, and more particularly his widow, of any of the glory that may be attendant upon his last job." In reality, Howard wrote the first giant draft, and then it was passed around like crazy among writers for tweaks and rewrites, so who knows how many technically deserve credit. Selznick himself has said that he was responsible for much of the big picture structure of the movie, and that's one of the most ambitious aspects of the whole thing, so he likely deserved a credit himself. I know this is a running theme, but again, Selznick deserves probably 10 Oscars for how he corralled all of this together. Like, we can hand them to him Snow White style. Okay, we can get through the Craft Awards pretty quickly because back in the 30s there was very little reporting on the intricacies of these minor awards, so I don't have too much to say. Best Cinematography is broken up into black and white and color categories, and there are only 2 nominees in each for some reason. Gone with the Wind is an obvious winner in the color category. I mean, look at these shots alone, and it should come as no surprise. In the black and white category, Wuthering Heights wins over Stagecoach, which, sure, I guess, I'd probably give it to Stagecoach, actually, because there's a lot more dynamic camera work going on in that movie with all of the stagecoach chases and such. Also, other movies like Of Mice and Men or The Women were shot really nicely and could have and maybe should have been nominated here just as easily. Best Art Direction went to Gone with the Wind as well, in a category that has a million nominees for some reason. And while The Wizard of Oz would have also been a great winner, Gone with the Wind's sets are pretty incredible. Also, speaking of sets, this is sort of like Gone with the Wind Trivia 101, but during the famous scene where Atlanta is burning down, the debris used for those fires were actually made up of sets from Selznick's old movies, like King Kong and stuff. Best Score is a full-on mess this year. Apparently the year prior, a movie, 100 Men and a Girl, had won the award, but it was controversial because the movie used pre-existing classical music and didn't have a credited composer. So this year they add a Best Original Score category for music that's totally new, and then they have the Best Scoring category, which can feature pre-existing material. But then some movies are nominated in both categories, so I truly do not understand what's going on. There are also like 12 to 13 nominees in each category. All I really have to say is that while the Wizard of Oz score, which wins, is great, like take the Twister scene for example, Gone with the Wind losing Best Original Score is absolutely crazy. Max Steiner literally changed the game with Gone with the Wind. I think it's impossible to hear the iconic Tara's theme without feeling something. And then for the best scoring category, the winner is Stagecoach, and that's a fun, propulsive score too. Best Original Song also went to The Wizard of Oz for Over the Rainbow. Absolutely legendary win, probably the best in the category's history if we're being honest. And it's worth noting here that Judy Garland didn't get any award for this song since she wasn't a writer on it, but the Academy did give her a special juvenile award for her performance in the movie. For Best Sound Recording, I can't tell you much. There's also an obscene amount of nominees in this category, but the Irene Dunne Charles Boyer romantic drama, When Tomorrow Comes, wins it, which seems weird to me when there are such bombastic epics like Gone with the Wind or The Rains Came, which were also nominated. And speaking of The Rains Came, it wins the first ever competitive award for Best Visual Effects, then called Best Special Effects. The Rains Came was sort of like a proto-modern blockbuster in that it got a bunch of tech nominations, but nothing above the line. And the effects in this movie are genuinely great. This win is so well deserved. It stars Myrna Loy and Tyrone Power and George Brent, and Maria Ouspenskaya is there too, as subjects of romantic intrigue in colonial India, but halfway through the movie there's a massive earthquake and flood that destroys their entire town. The water effects are nuts and scary, and the whole movie is pretty good, but it's definitely worth watching for those disaster scenes alone. For Best Editing, this category is usually thought of as a Best Picture bellwether, and while that trend didn't actually solidify until the late 50s, and Gone with the Wind is actually the first Best Picture winner to also win Best Editing, I still think looking at this list of nominees gives us a pretty good idea of the main contenders. And again, Gone with the Wind is a fantastic winner. I dare you to find a 4-hour movie that flows this well, it clips along flawlessly, and they fit in so much story in such a coherent way. Also, I need to mention quickly that we don't have Best Costume Design here because the category didn't exist until the late 40s, but obviously if it did exist, Gone with the Wind would have won in a cakewalk. Scarlett's costumes, every single dress, literally point to any dress throughout the entire 4 hours, and it's just so good. That green and white one from the opening scenes, the curtain dress, that striped one she wears when she's walking with Rhett and the baby stroller. Come on. Walter Plunkett is a legend, so really Gone with the Wind should have 9 Oscars. Also, the Best Makeup and Hairstyling category didn't exist yet, and that likely would have gone to either The Wizard of Oz or The Hunchback of Notre Dame, but I digress. Now we can get into some of the real tight races of the night, the actors. I'm actually really excited to talk about this category. I mean, like most friends of Dorothy, I naturally just don't care as much about the men's acting awards, but this is one of the stronger lineups I can think of. When you look back, the big question everyone asks about this year is, how did Jimmy Stewart lose? How did Clark Gable lose? And how did they lose to Robert Donat, an actor that most people don't talk about anymore, in Goodbye Mr. Chips, a stodgy movie that people also don't talk about anymore? And I wish I had the silver bullet answer, but I think that ultimately this was just a very close competitive year, and a particular amount of passion for Donat's performance pushed him over the edge. When you zoom out and take a look at this year's wins and see Gone with the Wind sweeping, your first question should be, why was Gable the only one to miss out on a win? Gable is obviously just Rhett Butler incarnate, the perfect casting for this charismatic, alluring, dishonorable, sarcastic guy. He's also pretty definitively the most famous man in the entire industry at this time. The story goes that in the car after the Oscars ceremony, Selznick, whose night could have hardly gone better, still complained to his publicist, why couldn't we get Gable? I think what caused him to dip below his competition was the fact that this really isn't his movie. Gone with the Wind is like 80% about its women, brilliantly crafted that way by Margaret Mitchell, by the way. So while Rhett is a great character and Gable gives one of the most iconic performances ever, the viewer is definitely positioned in Scarlett's head, viewing him from an outsider perspective. And we ultimately know that Gable wasn't even in second place. The Los Angeles Times actually leaked the results of the vote on the day of the ceremony, and it was revealed that Gable actually got the third most votes, after Donat and Jimmy Stewart. Now, Stewart is another confounding factor here. Like, Stewart's performance is one that really feels like the most rousing and populist option for voters. This is Stewart's first nomination. He's coming off a role in last year's Best Picture winner, and this is the inflection point in his career where he becomes a quintessential leading man. He perfectly modulates his performance between the naive newcomer and the betrayed, determined last man standing. And there are some explosive moments in the movie where, I think it's impossible not to be completely riveted by what Stewart's making you feel. He also won the New York Film Critics Circle Award, which is pretty much the only vague precursor we have to go off of at this time. But again, I said it earlier, people in the industry were going fucking nuts for Donat's performance. One critic said that Mr. Chips has already joined the ranks of fictional immortals. Donat's performance puts him in line for this year's Academy Award, an achievement of the first order. In the 30s, the idea of transformation and portrayals of characters over a long period of time were thought of as innovative and novel and impressive. So there was particular praise given to the way Donat was able to transform himself into different versions of this character, as he lives basically his entire life within the movie. The Chips of the tattered old gown and fireside pot of tea was quite a different personality from that of the earnest, slightly frightened young master who first came to Brookfield. Makeup, good as it was, couldn't account for that change. It was Donat's art. One reporter recounted that on the premiere night for Goodbye Mr. Chips, quote, Hollywood was certain that Robert Donat's performance established a new high watermark for actors. Going up the aisle with Paul Muni after the picture had finished, Muni said in all seriousness, that is the greatest performance by the greatest actor on the screen. And of course Muni liked it because Donat was really following the same serious, transformative, makeup-heavy acting method that Muni himself had become known for. Donat had been building up cachet as an actor in Britain throughout the 30s, most famously in Hitchcock's The 39 Steps, but then, after becoming a contracted actor for the British subset of MGM, the studio was briefly able to angle him as a prestige star. The year before this, in 1938, Donat was nominated for another MGM drama, The Citadel, and he was considered one of the bigger contenders to win. So he also had some built-up goodwill, and people were just dying to reward him. Even with all the legends in this category, none of them were a bigger box office draw in 1939 than Mickey Rooney, who gets nominated for Babes in Arms. This is really the sweet spot of his career, where his brash, charismatic persona slid perfectly into these precocious adolescent roles. He was incredibly beloved, which earned him this Best Actor nomination at age 19, and he remains the second youngest nominee ever. And I'm about to stand on my soapbox a bit, because a lot of people these days like to get smug about not liking Mickey Rooney. I think his style of humor doesn't translate as well to modern audiences, and especially after the Breakfast at Tiffany's thing, and the fact that he was known as a really arrogant figure in his personal life, everyone likes to dismiss him and say he was annoying. But this is truly a great comedic performance. He's a star, he's singing, he's doing incredible impressions. The movie's almost entirely on his shoulders, and he shows an insane sense of showmanship while he's literally younger than, like, the average Stranger Things actor, so I think it's a cool and well-deserved nomination. To round out the nominations, we have Laurence Olivier as Heathcliff in Wuthering Heights. It should speak to the strength of this category that Olivier in a legendary literary period drama is the last one I'm mentioning here. Though he was incredibly successful in the world of British theater, Wuthering Heights was his first major Hollywood movie. And William Wyler, the actor's director that he was, is credited for basically teaching Olivier on set how to dial back his theatrical, stagey tendencies and adapt to the comparatively naturalistic mode of movie acting. He was praised along with the movie for the brooding romantic intensity he brings, and got his first Oscar nomination here. I think this is part of what makes 1939 such a legendary year in movies. Like, in this category alone, we have breakout nominations for Jimmy Stewart, Mickey Rooney, and Laurence Olivier, all of whom would become some of the most prolific and legendary actors in the history of old Hollywood. The big omissions from this category were Paul Muni in Juarez and Spencer Tracy in Stanley and Livingston. Muni was one of the biggest stars of this period, known for his transformative, early method acting style. He had won Best Actor a few years prior, so him playing a historical figure in a big historical drama should have been a shoo-in, but he sort of flopped here. People called his performance wooden, which I can attest to even though I really like that movie. Spencer Tracy had just won the previous 2 Best Actor awards, so people were just like, okay, I guess we're supposed to nominate him every time now, but then they didn't. Right up until reviews for Gone with the Wind started dropping in the very last couple weeks of the year, the industry had all but engraved Bette Davis's name on the Best Actress Oscar for Dark Victory. Even though she had only become a star like 5 years prior, Bette Davis already had 2 Academy Awards and was universally thought of as the best actress to ever live. Whenever there would be a quip in newspapers or at an Oscars ceremony about who has the most awards, who's the gold standard, it was always Bette Davis.
Aren't they beautiful? I feel like I'm in Bette Davis's living room.
You can think of it like the way people talk about Meryl today, but the difference is Bette was just getting her career started. When Dark Victory came out in March of 1939, there was instant universal Bette praise. She had fought to get this movie made for a reason. The LA Times called it a portrayal so frighteningly mature, so electrifying, that all she had done in the past seemed like the veriest rehearsal for it. It was called her best performance, and Dark Victory was called a 4-handkerchief picture because of how emotional she made you. One review sums it up pretty succinctly. Miss Davis mows you down. And it is a towering role. She plays brash, she plays loud, she plays drunk, pitiful, commanding, scared. So it was in the bag. 3 Oscars in 5 years. Why not? If anyone deserves it, it's Bette. But when Gone with the Wind reviews started coming out in late December, the world quickly became acquainted with the mythic titan that is Vivien Leigh as Scarlett O'Hara. I mean, starting out with that very first scene where she's sitting on the veranda being bored by these 2 suitors, and she's like, war, war, war. Vivien Leigh just nails it from beat 1. You instantly understand almost everything you need to know about how Scarlett navigates the world. She's petulant and childish, but also calculated and mercenary. At all times, she's weaponizing her charm or her sociopathy to her advantage. There's just so much there, and Leigh is channeling every syllable of Mitchell's text. Everyone who had doubted Vivien Leigh was instantly proven wrong. If you remember at the beginning of this video when I was introducing Gone with the Wind, God knows how long ago that was, I mentioned that the Daughters of the Confederacy were protesting Vivien Leigh's casting. Well, the day after the premiere, the organization's president said, "No one can quarrel now with the selection of Miss Leigh as Scarlett. She is Miss Mitchell's Scarlett to the life. The whole thing has me overcome. It seems to have affected us all that way." Even gossip queen Hedda Hopper came out and admitted, "Her performance has made me do something I dislike very much, and that is chew my own words." In January, I devoted a whole column to a seething, scornful denunciation of David O. Selznick because he couldn't find, in a whole country, a Scarlett, and therefore chose an English girl. And now, by golly, I've got to congratulate him and everyone concerned for picking Vivien Leigh. It's an incredible, unbelievable performance. In fact, she didn't play Scarlett, she was Scarlett. Hers wasn't a performance, it was a whole career. And I honestly couldn't say it better myself. I'm just constantly in awe that a performance this colossal and complicated and funny exists, and that something that feels so specifically American and gritty could come from an upper-crust, classically trained Brit. I mean, it goes without saying that Vivien Leigh is one of the greats, if not the greatest. This is one of the most well-rounded and precise characterizations I have ever seen. Every choice she makes reads on camera, you see the gears turning. This is a real person in front of you, not a character. It should handily make it onto any credible list of the best performances ever shown on screen. Not to mention that she has a full 2.5 hours of screen time, which is over an hour more than all of her competitors, even 2 hours more than some of her competitors. But even though I, along with everyone in 1939, am heaping all this praise on her, we still definitely had a race here. Betty's pedigree was not something to mess around with. Some people still thought that Betty may actually pull ahead of Vivian, and there was one sneaky loophole at the forefront. At this time in Oscars history, extras were allowed to vote in the awards. The LA Times reported that there were 8,000 extras voting compared to 4,000 other eligible members. And the extras tended to like people that they've worked with before. Bette Davis, a Warner Bros. Contract player who had been in 20 movies over the past 5 years, was thought to be much better known and liked among this demographic. Additionally, Betty had starred in 4 separate box office hits this year, so her range as a performer was on full display. In addition to the socialite going blind, she got to play Queen Elizabeth I, a Belgian princess who loses her mind, and a spinster in Civil War America. One extra who was interviewed praised Vivien Leigh's performance, but then said, "Until I see her as a dope fiend, a queen, a sex-starved old maid, a neurotic who's going blind, I won't know whether she can equal Betty or not." Ultimately, of course, Vivian wins, though the Los Angeles Times leak of the winners did show that apparently the vote was very close between her and Betty. Much like every other category this year, though, even the nominees who didn't win are pretty significant in their own right and mark key moments in Hollywood. Greta Garbo had her big industry last hurrah with Ninotchka. She remained incredibly popular in Europe, but after a few years of waning popularity in the United States in the late 30s, culminating in the very extravagant Hollywood failure in 1937, Conquest, an organization of theater owners penned that infamous ad in The Hollywood Reporter declaring her box office poison. So MGM decided to switch gears with Garbo, challenging her to step outside her somber, aloof persona and essentially lead a rom-com. The movie was advertised everywhere with the promise that, in this movie, Garbo laughs. Since Garbo was such a huge figure, one of the biggest stars ever to come out of the movie industry at this point, people were definitely looking for a reason to love her again, and in a weaker year, she probably could have ridden this narrative all the way to a win. Next, Greer Garson's nomination for Goodbye Mr. Chips represents another Hollywood inflection point, since this marks the discovery of the biggest and most popular prestige actress of the 1940s. As many of MGM's biggest stars of the 30s, like Garbo or Norma Shearer or Joan Crawford, had been branded with the box office poison Scarlet Letter and were either slowing their careers down or retiring entirely, Garson was shipped over from the UK and brought in as their new big leading lady. Frankly, I don't think Greer Garson gets the respect she deserves, and I hear a lot of snide comments aimed her way these days. I guess her matriarchal, dutiful wife presence feels very of her time, whereas many of the old Hollywood icons that remain adored today, like a Bette Davis or Marlene Dietrich, remain popular because they still feel bold and modern and transgressive. But there's a real art to what Garson does. Reviews posited her as a naturalistic, aspirational figure. One said, "As a matter of fact, there hasn't been anyone on screen so womanly in years, and what a relief Miss Garson is after all this Hollywood glamour." Which is funny because she's also totally gorgeous and glamorous, but I guess what they're going for is she's not ostentatious. And Garson nails her debut performance here. She's only in the movie for like 20 minutes, making it one of the top 5 shortest performances ever nominated in the category, but she totally steals the movie, and her energy feels explosive compared with the stately plainness it's surrounded by. Almost every review said something along the lines of, "Who is this girl? We love her. She's going to become a massive star." And the last nominee here is Irene Dunne in Love Affair. This was her 4th nomination of 5, and she's one of the biggest actresses of the time who wound up never winning an Oscar. It's a shame because she's great in pretty much everything. I'll even go to bat for her first nomination in Cimarron, which a lot of people don't want to talk about. But Love Affair is a great showcase of both her comedic and dramatic talents, and the movie was such a cultural moment that this nomination felt inevitable. There are definitely some unfortunate omissions in the category this year. I think Jean Arthur stands out in particular with two confident, emotionally pitch-perfect performances in both Mr. Smith Goes to Washington and Only Angels Have Wings, and I really wish she had gotten a nomination for one of those. I guess in place of either Greer or Irene Dunne, but I actually like all of these performances. Also, Judy Garland as Dorothy is an obvious choice here, but like I said earlier, she won that special Juvenile Academy Award, so she was sort of out of competition here, I think. This is one of those wins where it's really just the perfect person winning for their ideal archetype at an ideal time. In Stagecoach, Thomas Mitchell plays a drunken doctor who's a little bit of a mess, but also endearing. The movie is basically a 6 or 7 person ensemble for most of its runtime, but he gets a good amount of space to shine and brings a sort of melancholy wisdom to the stock character type he's playing. Again, he's a very naturally likable presence. The performance does stand on its own as a win, but it also helps that basically Mitchell was having a banner year. This was really only his 3rd year in Hollywood, but he was nominated for his first Oscar in 1937 and rose very quickly as one of the most beloved character actors in the business. From there, he wound up with a role in the biggest movie ever made and Best Picture winner as Scarlett's father. He was also in the probable Best Picture runner-up and had a linchpin supporting role in the Howard Hawks commercial hit Only Angels Have Wings, and was also in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which was another success. Nowadays, awards-friendly movies have become much more of a cottage industry, so typically we see performers gear up for their one big performance per year that carries them through award season. But back in the days of the studio system, where movie production was a very fast-moving assembly line, it's a lot more common to have these actors who have like 5 hits in a year. So the award becomes a way to honor their body of work as a whole. And Mitchell was very self-effacing and charming, even at the ceremony, where in his acceptance speech he says,
I didn't know I was quite that good.
This is also the first time in this category's history where we get 2 nominations from the same movie. And granted, the category had only been around for a few years at this point, but a stat is a stat. Claude Rains is nominated as the archetype of government corruption in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Harry Carey is nominated as the president of the Senate. Claude Rains plays a pivotal role, and I think even based on name recognition alone, people today think he should have won. It's a great performance with a definite Oscar moment, and career-wise he was ramping up into his hot streak of movies like Now Voyager and Casablanca and Notorious. But to me, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington is so the Jimmy Stewart show that Rains kind of gets overshadowed. Harry Carey gets a coattail nomination off the success of the movie as a whole. He isn't in it much, but it's not like he gets one big standout scene either. I think people maybe liked his role because he's kind of a stand-in for us as the audience. He was also sort of a fixture of silent era cinema as a star of westerns, so it was also a bit of a legacy nom. In one of her columns, Hedda Hopper said that it was so nice to see him come back in so human a role. So I think that's the angle people were coming from. Someone who I think might have been in second place here was Brian Aherne in Juarez. He plays an Austrian duke who Napoleon assigns as a proxy ruler of Mexico. In Mexico, his primary opponent is the titular Benito Juarez, the indigenous nationalist leader. Critics praised Aherne's role and emphasized how sympathetic it was. I think he does a good job of portraying the moral conflicts of someone who feels more a victim of circumstance than anything. In fact, the studio actually considered cutting some of Aherne's scenes, worrying that he was so good that he'd get more attention than Paul Muni, who was supposed to be the star as Juarez. And they were right, Aherne does steal the movie. His role is also pretty large. I'd argue that he's basically the lead. The movie really isn't so much about Juarez as it is about him. In fact, the only reason the movie is called Juarez is because it was in Muni's contract. Muni had earned the right to pretty much do whatever he wanted at this point in his career. Also, Ahern's star was generally on the rise at this point. He had just married Joan Fontaine, and he was actually considered to star opposite her in Rebecca the following year because his stock was soaring after this performance. Over time, a lot of his bigger movies aren't really the ones that have aged into popular classics, but he was definitely having a moment here. Rounding out the category is Brian Donlevy as a brutal sergeant in Beau Geste who terrorizes our protagonist brothers. It's a fairly straightforward villain role. He's somewhat memorable and cruel. I guess you could almost place it in the Christoph Waltz, J.K. Simmons vein of supporting actor villains, but it's definitely less electric than those. Ironically, this is the only nomination for Beau Geste, and the movie itself is among my favorites of the year, directed by William Wellman, who also did Wings. But if I could only single out one aspect of the movie to nominate, let's just say it wouldn't be this performance. In terms of nominees that missed out, there aren't too many glaring ones. You could say something like Jean Renoir in The Rules of the Game, which would be cool but certainly wasn't going to happen, or someone from The Wizard of Oz, or Cedric Hardwicke in a fantastic repressed role in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. The biggest standout misses to me are actually Thomas Mitchell's other roles from this year, like in Gone with the Wind or Only Angels Have Wings, so I guess his win is a testament to that. Now it's time for probably the most talked about acting award recipient of the night, Hattie McDaniel in Gone with the Wind, where she became the first Black actor to ever win an Oscar. And she'd remained the only one until 25 years later during the Civil Rights Movement when Sidney Poitier came along. As Mammy, the head slave at Tara and Scarlett's nurse since she was a newborn, Hattie slowly reveals herself to be one of the key foils of the movie. She plays the comedic beats perfectly, of course, with plenty of legendary line readings, but she's also one of the only characters in the entire movie who's able to meet Scarlett on her level, and sees all of her manipulation tactics exactly for what they are. And in Mammy's breakdown at the end, which they shoot as a perfect one-take panning up the staircase, she communicates these cathartic waves of emotion that are essentially Gone with the Wind's thesis statement. The terror and inevitability that buildings will fall and families will crumble and civilizations will turn over and time speeds forward, and we, as people, have to bear witness to it all. McDaniel herself described Mammy as someone who was fearless, who cringed before no one, who did not talk in whispers, walk on tiptoe, who criticized a white woman's morals, and who showed real emotion. Her relationship with Rhett is one of the highlights of the movie too. There's so much unspoken depth to Mammy, and it's a real testament to Hattie that she's able to communicate it all and more. So Hattie McDaniel is an incredible trailblazer, and her legacy is very much wrapped up in the debates had around Gone with the Wind more broadly. Many Black activists at the time viewed McDaniel as someone who was implicitly condoning the harmful stereotypes and treatment that Black performers faced in the industry by continuing to take roles like this. After news of her casting came out, journalist Earl J. Morris commented, "We feel proud over the fact that Hattie McDaniel won the coveted role of Mammy. It means about $2,000 for Miss McDaniel in individual advancement and nothing in racial advancement." All of this sort of backlash was met with her well-known pithy comeback. "I'd rather play a maid for $700 a week than be one for $7 a week." In reviews, Hattie's performance was often praised, and as I mentioned way at the beginning of this video, her performance and the implications it could have for the industry was often the reason that a few Black public figures ultimately viewed the movie as a net positive. Lillian Johnson, one of those Black columnists who was a defender of Gone with the Wind and the symbolic importance of Hattie's role, wrote that Miss McDaniel has found that sometimes one conquers by stooping and succeeds by yielding. Another Black reporter, Harry B. Weber, praised the movie through Hattie's performance, stating that people of all races weep copiously in the huge audiences, and Hattie McDaniel makes as many weep as does Scarlett and the others. Once Hattie began getting this praise from the broader industry, and even an Oscar nomination, many activists rallied around her. I found a letter to the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier basically lobbying for everyone to throw their support behind Hattie for the win, and this was a newspaper that was pretty fervently anti-Gone with the Wind. But the idea was that if she gets the win for this, the movie will have at least contributed to racial progress in some way. Other black newspapers endorsed her as well. Even a black sorority, for example, wrote to Selznick expressing hope that she'd win. But to take a step back, in researching all of this, I was most interested in trying to learn as much as I could about Hattie's own perspective on all of this. I eventually came across an op-ed she wrote for the Atlanta Constitution, implicitly responding to the backlash she got for accepting the role. She says, "Now that I am working in the picture, I find there is something more than just working at my profession in doing the part of Mammy." She says that she sees her role as an opportunity to glorify black womanhood, the strength of people like Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, and Charity Still, women who were all slaves themselves. She continues, "I knew that Mammy in the Civil War picture would have to wear a handkerchief on her head to depict her people in slavery, but this would only serve to emphasize the improved status of our race today." Hearing this perspective come from her so directly really broke my heart. Hattie was constrained by her time in really shameful ways, but she was using the limited tools that she had to pay tribute to the women of a past generation that she herself had been raised by, and ensure that they would at least be represented in some way in Hollywood. So, though many argued that she should be avoiding movies like Gone with the Wind entirely, Hattie thought it better to work within the system to try and bring humanity to a role that easily could have been a one-note caricature. And I did learn that articles like this one were the idea of one of Selznick's publicists as a means to temper backlash, so I suppose that you could take Hattie's words there with a grain of salt, but this is pretty consistent with comments she'd make after the fact too. On Oscar night, she reportedly told Luella Parsons, "I love Mammy. I think I understood her because my own grandmother worked on a plantation not unlike Tara." Anyway, I know that we're on a tangent right now, but Hattie is truly one of the most multidimensional old Hollywood figures out there. She's a fantastic actress and an even more fascinating cultural figure. Hattie's win was treated like an industry milestone, and it also calmed some of the activist backlash to the movie. In articles after the Oscars, she was singled out for being the first black winner ever, sometimes being used as one of the main headlines. From what I gather, it feels like a real Hollywood cognitive dissonance moment, where they all loved being able to pat themselves on the back about how they were so colorblind and righteous, while mentally avoiding the fact that Hattie wasn't even allowed to attend the premiere of her own movie, and had to sit alone with her agent at a sidelined, segregated table during the Academy ceremony. In her breakdown of the night, Perez Hopper wrote, "It was refreshing in this cockeyed world when we're fighting for freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of America, that in a town at which every poisoned pen in the universe is directing a flow of vitriolic words, that we were actually honoring English, Irish, Jewish, and colored, proving that art is universal." So it's like, okay, I see we're feeling very self-righteous at the moment. But regardless, Hattie's brilliant performance is her brilliant performance, and it's so cool that it was awarded. I mean, let's be clear, there is certainly no supporting Oscar win in recent years by my metric that holds a candle to Hattie's work here. I also want to give a shout out to another supporting black character in the movie, Butterfly McQueen as Prissy. Butterfly McQueen is such a star, and I wish I had time to go further into her story. She's actually an interesting counterpoint to Hattie, and someone who viewed the industry much more negatively. But I'm also trying to keep this video from becoming longer than some of the movies I'm talking about, so I'll just encourage you to go learn more about her. But back to the awards race. So Olivia de Havilland was tough competition for Hattie, with her role in Gone with the Wind as Melanie, Scarlett's sister-in-law / nemesis / friend / foil. I'm gonna start gushing again because Melanie is another one of my favorite movie and book characters of all time. Where Scarlett throws social convention out the window to get what she wants, Melanie plays well within her given role as a woman of the 1800s, but still exerts equal power through kindness and dignity. De Havilland is the perfect person for this, and she plays it in such a way where what initially seems like naivete is eventually revealed to instead be great intelligence and grace and selflessness. I have a sort of hard time deciding between Olivia and Hattie for the award, and at the time, the press seemed to think it could go either way, so I'm ultimately very happy with the way it turned out, also because Olivia had 2 Oscars coming her way in the next decade anyway. But I do love all of the anecdotes that have come up over the years about how devastated Olivia was about not winning. After the category was announced, Olivia apparently ran into the kitchen at the venue and burst into tears. Selznick's wife, Irene, had to go and get her and basically tell her to grow up and be professional. And in a 2015 interview, she said that for weeks after she lost, she was convinced there was no God. I love actors who are openly competitive and dramatic about awards. I think it makes it fun. Geraldine Fitzgerald in Wuthering Heights is another nominee from this year who just became more and more fascinating the more I researched her, because she's sort of known as a great Hollywood star that never was. This was Fitzgerald's breakout year. She landed supporting roles as Bette Davis's close friend in Dark Victory and as Isabella in Wuthering Heights. And the industry took to her pretty quickly. Reviews for Dark Victory often singled her out, probably even more than in Wuthering Heights, but Wuthering Heights is what she gets the nomination for. What makes Fitzgerald interesting to me is the way she handled her career and her proximity to so many of the most iconic roles of this era. David O. Selznick actually wanted her to test for the lead role in Rebecca, and for the role of Melanie in Gone with the Wind. I mean, these are both eventual Best Picture winners, both adaptations of extremely popular books, and any new actress would be dying to get a call like that. But Geraldine turned him down for both movies. First of all, for Gone with the Wind, she wanted the meteor role of Scarlett, not Melanie, and she wouldn't budge. Fitzgerald was extremely finicky about the way she made career choices. She was still in love with the theater, and stipulated that, around her film work, she'd still have 6 months free per year to act in plays. This obviously limited her ability to take starring roles, and kept her from leveling up to A-list status. She admits this even herself in a 1971 profile from the New York Times. She says, "I was really a fanatic about my, relationship to the performing arts. Indentured I was to this demon, which I thought was called integrity. The demon's real name was dumb." She later continues, "I don't exactly have regrets, but if you ask me, did I suffer for my mistakes? I say yes. No one had ever thrown away good breaks with such monotonous frequency, and had to sit by and watch everyone else play parts that I knew could have been mine." I don't know, I just find her approach to the industry so cool, especially for the time. To be a relatively unknown actress saying no to the biggest producer in the world in 1939 for the sake of preserving artistic integrity, that's kind of legendary. After this big banner year, she sort of just petered out over the next decade, but luckily she ended up in a good place, eventually reemerging as a character actor and a successful theater performer and director through the 60s and 70s. We round out the category with 2 of the biggest character actresses of this late 30s era, Edna May Oliver and Maria Uspenskaya. Oliver was known for playing acerbic, often wealthy old women. In Drums Along the Mohawk, which is one of the other John Ford movies that came out in 1939, she plays a widowed frontier woman who takes in our protagonist couple after Native Americans destroy their home in rural New York in the 1700s. She's playing a very in-your-face part and injects a lot of energy into the picture. Granted, I don't really know if I'm saying that as a compliment or not, but regardless, critics praised her at the time. This was her only Oscar nomination, but it's worth noting that some of her work in the early 30s, something like Cimarron, for example, where she's great, was pretty much precluded from nomination because the supporting actress category didn't exist yet. Uspenskaya was a prestigious Russian theater performer. She actually worked directly with
Stanislavski,
and also taught
Lee Strasberg.
So she has quite the pedigree. She shifted her gaze to Hollywood later in life, often playing vaguely Eastern European old grandmas or royalty or fortune tellers with her very pronounced accent. She's sort of notorious for the 2 nominations she got in the late 30s, one this year for Love Affair and one for Dodsworth in 1936, because both are very small performances and she doesn't do much in either of them. Essentially, everyone in the industry liked her. Here's one review in the LA Times that explained why she could possibly win the Oscar. Dear old lady. So that's the general consensus. In terms of snubs, again, not too much that's glaring. The very modern day example people like to give is Margaret Hamilton for playing the Wicked Witch of the West, but a genre nomination like that, even today, would be extremely rare. Claire Trevor is maybe my favorite part of Stagecoach, and she's kind of a lead, kind of supporting, but the movie is ensemble enough to make the case for her. And Rita Hayworth also kills it in Only Angels Have Wings, which was her breakout role. So we'll start out with the best live action shorts, which are broken up into 2 categories. The 1-reel films, which are around 10 minutes long, and the 2-reel films, which are around 20 minutes long. These types of shorts would typically play in movie theaters as a supplement to the actual feature you bought a ticket for. A lot of times they were educational, news or history related, travelogues, etc. In the 2-reel category, the winner was Sons of Liberty, which briefly tells the story of Chaim Solomon, a man who helped finance the Revolutionary War. This is a Warner Brothers short, so it utilizes some of their contract players. It starred Claude Rains and is directed by Michael Curtiz, who is of course very well known for directing Casablanca and Mildred Pierce. It's really high production value, and it feels like a real movie. Just a short, relatively bland one with no real narrative. The other nominees were Drunk Driving and 5x5, and I couldn't find either of these online. Drunk Driving came from MGM's Crime Doesn't Pay series of shorts, where they basically show people doing bad things and then tell you that it's wrong to do bad things. And this series actually won a couple Oscars throughout the 30s. 5x5 was a short about the 5th birthday of the Dion quintuplets, Canadian siblings who are apparently the first quintuplets in recorded history to survive infancy. And apparently 2 of them are still alive today, which is crazy. In the 1-reel category, nominees included one episode of Information Please, which was essentially a radio quiz show that RKO started filming and showing in theaters. Then a short called Profit Without Honor, which was another one of these educational shorts about Matthew Maury, who in the 1800s pioneered the field of modern oceanography by tracking ocean currents and wind patterns. There's also a nominee called Sword Fishing, which is actually narrated by Ronald Reagan from back in his actor days. And this one is just a filmed fishing trip where Howard Hill, who was a well-known Hollywood archery stuntsman, hunts swordfish with, you guessed it, a bow and arrow. But the winner in this category eludes me to this day, and I'm really annoyed about it. It's called Busy Little Bears, and it's not available online anywhere to my knowledge, and let me tell you, I have looked. There's one IMDb review from 2004, where I'm told that we follow 3 bear cubs in Yosemite, and there are owls, badgers, and skunks involved, and the antics are charming. So if anyone out there has any leads, I really want to watch this short, and I want to see these little bears and determine for myself just how busy they really are. The Best Animated Short category is really cute during this period of the Oscars because we're still in the early stages of animation where pretty much all there is on this front is Disney shorts, Tex Avery's Merry Melodies, stuff like that. The category started in 1930, and Walt Disney had won literally every single consecutive year from then until 1939, and he wins this year too. This is how Walt Disney became the man with the most Oscars, by the way. He had one short called The Pointer, which actually featured Mickey Mouse and Pluto, but the winner is another entry of his, The Ugly Duckling. It's very cute, a simple story about finding a community that accepts you. It's a nice way to spend 8 minutes. One non-Disney nominee is Detouring America, a Tex Avery cartoon just showing different vignettes of American landscapes like New York City, the Everglades, native reservations, the California Gold Rush, stuff like that. And the last nominee is Peace on Earth, which is definitely like 80 times more haunting and serious and ambitious than any of the others, so spoiler alert if you want to go watch it first. But basically, it shows a squirrel family telling the story of how humanity killed itself off with constant wars and left Earth to be inhabited by animals. And of course, the idea of humans extinguishing themselves due to war was definitely germane to the global landscape at the time and the decade that was to follow. So this one probably should have won, but, why not put one more in Walt Disney's pocket? Okay, we have made it through. I want to end by quickly sharing some of my favorite movies from this year that didn't play a big role at the Oscars. Because as much as I love Oscar stuff, there are a bunch of other incredible movies that simply weren't going to be on the Academy's radar. The Women from George Cukor is one of the coolest high-concept movies of the studio system. The whole thing only features female characters, there's not a single man ever seen on screen, and it's about this giant web of social interactions and deceit and affairs and divorces. Joan Crawford ate, Rosalind Russell especially ate, Norma Shearer is really good. There's Paulette Goddard, Joan Fontaine, Marjorie Main, Hedda Hopper even makes a little cameo, it's a real who's who. The movie is in black and white, but there's a 10-minute long fashion show in the middle of the movie that's filmed in color and is completely separate from the actual plot. Apparently, Cukor himself regretted this sequence, but it's stunning, and the artifice of it all almost becomes a microcosm of the movie as a whole for me, with this gay director exalting all these women as untouchable avant-garde beings in these gorgeous, fantastical tableaus. In my world, this would have gotten 10 Oscar nominations, but it's almost better for it to be an overlooked gem. Only Angels Have Wings technically did get one Oscar nomination for special effects, and I've brought it up in passing, but I'll mention it here again. This is a fantastic Howard Hawks movie about a group of cargo/airmail pilots at a base in South America. Cary Grant gives a great starring performance, Jean Arthur is fantastic, Rita Hayworth is great. It's just a very well-made, entertaining ensemble piece with a great sense of place, too. The story of The Last Chrysanthemum is amazing. It's directed by Kenji Mizoguchi, who's best known for his later movies like Ugetsu and Sancho the Bailiff. Mizoguchi is famous for his tales of suffering, especially women's suffering within the societal structures that they're placed in. This movie in particular focuses on a man trying to become a respected kabuki actor and his wife who supports him along the way. And on paper, that sounds like a movie where the wife is just going to have this thankless role, but here the entire movie is about the fact that the wife has a thankless role. It's very moving and beautifully shot. This is like a Sight and Sound poll level movie. One of the most highly regarded movies from this year is Jean Renoir's The Rules of the Game, about a bunch of bourgeois friends and their servants spending a couple days at a chateau. It feels very contemporary with great dialogue, it's cutting and complex with a sprawling cast. I have to be honest and say that it's not my favorite. I like it, but I like a lot of these other movies more. But either way, it's too big not to mention. The French movie I actually like better from this year is Le Jour se lève, directed by Marcel Carné, who's best known for directing Children of Paradise a few years later. This movie feels ahead of its time. There's a bit of noir, a bit of Antonioni-style stillness and grandeur, and it's also poetic and tense. And side note, Antonioni actually started out as an assistant director for Carné, so their similarities check out. I don't want to give the plot away, but it's essentially about a guy who's being pursued by the police and reflecting on the romance that got him in this situation. And it's really stunning. Definitely check it out. Lastly, The Hunchback of Notre Dame is maybe the most extravagant movie of this entire year after Gone with the Wind and The Wizard of Oz. They built like giant studio lot sets of Paris and the famous cathedral, and it all looks so incredible. Like, RKO just threw piles of money at this thing. And this is one of Charles Laughton's most famous performances too, as Quasimodo, where he's in full crazy makeup and wanted to be as physically uncomfortable as possible to put himself in the headspace of this character. So this is another standout movie for sure, especially if you're like me and were initially expecting it to be like sort of a B picture. It is not. And that's all I have. If you stuck through this entire video, thank you so much. And again, let me know if you plan to watch any of these movies or what your thoughts are on any of these categories, who you think should have won. This is really one of the most worthwhile early Hollywood years to dig into. Also, take this as a sign to watch Gone with the Wind for the first time if you've been putting it off, or rewatch it. And if the 220-minute length is what's scaring you, feel free to watch this video 2.5 times for practice.
Look at Scarlett, overrun with creeps. You and me both, sister. Why is it so hard to find a decent man? Rhett Butler.